It's a very, very great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, for me, to talk about this wonderful brief memoir, which I must admit I read in one sitting. I was doing some particularly interesting administration, and the book plopped in my lap. And after half an hour, I suddenly find myself near the end of this. It's really absolutely remarkable read. Only all academic books could be read. So it was such pleasure. And we all have our own stories about the Museum of Mankind, I'm sure, which I look forward to sharing with you together. But mine is, I remember being taken to the library when I was writing up my MA dissertation through a kind of an old-fashioned lift with the doors clanking, if I don't remember correctly, up into some room on the first floor somewhere, and being told very, very sternly that the moment I walked in, I had to sign my name. And I signed my name, and then I had all the books that I needed, and it was an absolute revelation. And really, I can say that much of the work that I'm even doing now is based on my early reading at the library there. And as I say, I'm sure many of us will have similar stories. Well, to help us understand the book better, I'm also very, very pleased that Nick Stanley can be with us, also a very good old friend of the RAI, a distinguished author who's worked very, very closely with the British Museum for many, many years. And indeed, this is how we're going to begin. I'll be right.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you, Ben, particularly. Normally, these events, the reviewer from the JRAI speaks or talks about the review that she or he has made. But the reviewer, Callum Robertson, isn't able to be with us. So I've been very pleased to step in. But I'd just like to share a couple of things he said in the review, which I think are really important. He starts by saying, the memoir of the museum professional is perhaps surprisingly a rare thing. Carefully curated behind the scenes content is frequently produced for screen and print, but much rarer is the opportunity to read an insider's account of the working life of the museum. In The Museum of Mankind, Man and Boy at the British Museum Ethnography Department, Ben Burt provides this personal perspective as he documents the trials and tribulations of the museum's ethnographic collections and the development of the experimental and short-lived Museum of Mankind. Short-lived? 27 years? That's quite an innings, I think. He concludes, Ben Burt's book is a unique and entertaining record of an important period in the development of the Anthropology Museum in Britain. And I thoroughly concur with this, and I think that those who've read it will also agree. It is something quite significantly different. There's only one thing that the JRI reviewer mentions that casts a slight shadow, and that's his recording that some people found they were disappointed at the lack of theory in the book. And I'm going to return to this a bit later in our discussion, because I actually thoroughly disagree with the reviewer here, and I'll tell you some of the reasons why when we discuss them with Ben. What I'd like to do, Ben, if we may to start, is actually take the title of your book, The Museum of Mankind, Man and Boy at the British Museum's Ethnography Department, and split it into two. The first is the Museum of Mankind, and a question that I think occurs to us today more frequently than it would have done in 1970 when the museum started, was why use the word mankind? And I think that's the question I want to put to you immediately.
Well, I have no part in the naming of it, and I was very, junior minor person when it all started. I can only think that they agreed with me, whoever the keepers and director or whatever, agreed with me that ethnography was a title for a museum which would just put people off, because nobody knows what it means, apart from people like us. And so mankind was a way of, ethnography actually means a description of culture, which so strictly speaking, it covers all of the British Museum and every other cultural museum, according to my understanding. But mankind is just about as all-encompassing and vague. I suppose the present-day objection would be to mankind rather than, well, we haven't really got an alternative yet, have we? I don't think. A museum of people, museum of the world. I don't know. I mean, it didn't seem a problem to me at the time, though it was questioned. But as far as I can see, that's why they called it that, just to try and find a name which people who they might attract to it would understand, I get some idea of what it meant, which, well, ethnography, well, you ask people what ethnography means. I mean, I've mentioned in the book, somebody said, is it the study of insects or something like this? I mean, that's the sort of response you get from lay people on this subject.
But there is somehow beneath that another question. I mean, you could have said Museum of Humankind, and I guess that would have worked. Though of course it doesn't actually scan. Museum of Mankind scans. Museum of Humankind doesn't scan. And I think just simple things like that are actually often quite important. That you don't think them academically or intellectually is important, but actually they do weigh. But it meant that the museum was called that. And if we actually look at the list of people involved in the museum, and I think if we look at your very interesting index, which is very idiosyncratic in its style, if we look at that, we look at the staffing of the Museum of Mankind, it's a very male institution.
Yes, when the ethnography department moved to this new museum near Piccadilly in 1970, that's when it opened, I think. Of the senior staff, there were just two women at first, Sheila Weir and Elizabeth Carmichael, later joined by Dorota Starzecker, or maybe not very much later. I'm not sure there are any other women working there. Probably there was the junior conservation officer, Linda White. I can't remember exactly when she started or when she left, but that was about it. If it was all men. And I suppose the whole BM was probably rather like that.
Yes, so it actually reflected something more about the culture of the museum generally.
I suppose so, but on the other hand, you see, the sort of alternatives they would have been thinking about would have been the Musée de l'Homme or the Museum of Man and things like that, which are even less inclusive than mankind. So, yeah, I mean, it's a product of its time in so many ways, and I suppose that includes the naming of it.
Yes, and that sort of reflects as much about us today as it does about then. The fact that it now stands out in a way it might not have done in, say, 1970.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we go to the second half of your title, the one that I really like is the Man and Boy at the British Museum. Tell us why you chose that.
Well, I mean, this is to be a memoir, not an academic study, for reasons which I can explain later. But it's just this old saying, you know, I've been doing this man and boy, the sort of thing that the old people say to the youngsters. And really, I was 19 when I first started there. And I was the youngest person in the department, I think, just about at that time. And now I'm the oldest. So it just seemed a way of summarising what I was trying to say, really, because it's about my own personal development as well as the museum and all my colleagues and everything.
Right. So let's go on now to ask you a bit about yourself in terms of how you came. First of all, let's look at the book itself. How did you come to write the book?
Well, I can't remember exactly when, but a few years before it was published, I suppose, when we moved back to the British Museum, and I was in the what became the Africa, Oceania and Americas department, whose keeper, if not then, but shortly after, was Listen Bolton, who's here this afternoon. And we'd go to the drinks after some event at the museum in one of the pubs over the road there. And Listen used to say, well, I used to sort of start on about, oh, what it was like years ago. I remember this, that and the other, and I remember all these jokes we used to play and so on and so forth when we were in the BM. And Listen said, you should write about that. And I thought to myself, well, it doesn't really make a book, does it? I didn't really think much of the idea for quite a while. And then, I don't know, after perhaps she persuaded me, or I came round to the idea that if I was to write it as a memoir, including those kinds of things, rather than an academic study, it might be worth doing. So that's what got me onto it, really. Yeah.
Right. And it is a history of your involvement in the museum. Do you want to tell us a bit about how you came to join the museum, and what your background was?
Right. Well, I was brought up on a farm in Somerset. I was sent to a private boarding school, which I didn't like, and I got good O-levels, but going on to do A-levels, I was absolutely useless. I got a B, a D and an E, and that was after trying twice for each of those things. I should add actually to this list of achievements that I failed my 11 plus as well. And I later failed mock O-level maths, so I didn't even have maths at O-level. So I did some A-levels, a correspondence course in a college in Bristol, and then I think an uncle suggested, why don't you see if you could get some work in Bristol City Museum? So he or we wrote there, and they said they'd take me on. And I was there for a year in the end. I started off, I don't know, doing some dog's body work, stuffing envelopes for the Prehistoric Society. It ended up in the conservation workshop, sticking pots together, and then from that working on all the ethnographic displays in the museum's gallery, as nobody else had the time or probably the interest to do it. And that really got me interested in the subject. I started reading some of the anthropology books that are in the library and things like this. Job came up at the British Museum as assistant conservation officer. So I got my colleagues in the museum in Bristol to make some photos of the pots I stuck together and sent them off with an application. They interviewed me, gave me the job. And 18 months doing that, which I really enjoyed actually. Good friends and colleagues, interesting work, working with some really important artifacts from all over the world, especially Polynesia, Melanesia and Africa, and I can't remember anywhere else come to that. We were going through all the galleries, cleaning them stage by stage. But I always wanted to, it wasn't quite enough for me. I really wanted to understand a bit more about the background of those cultures. And I was reading books from the library, like these old Smithsonian Institution ethnographies from the early 20th century and University of Hawaii ones, things like that. Anyway, so I applied to university. I didn't have much of a chance because I didn't have Latin, which was needed for most of those courses, and of course I didn't have maths. So I only got the job, actually, sorry, not the job, I only got a place at University College London in the anthropology department because I got a reference from Brian Cranston, who was one of our senior curators, who used to teach material culture studies for that course. And they interviewed me and gave me a place, and so that was it, really. And 5 years there, 3 years at a BSc, 2 years not finishing a master's, so I finished it later, but not then. And this job came up in the Museum of Mankind, research assistant for education. So I applied for that and I got it, so that was it, really. It's been like, well, it's been very quite straightforward, but a set of lucky chances, I suppose, that I ended up in that job, and that's what took me on to where I am still now.
It sounds as though you've done a lot of self-education. Was there any help at Bristol in terms of training you?
Not really. The conservation and taxidermy sections in the basement where I was working used to play all sorts of jokes on each other and have water pistol fights and God knows what. In army, I'd be using acetone to scrub old glue off an old broken pot that had been mended, and somebody came up and chuck a batch in it while I was doing it. You know, by the way, it's not explosive; it just burns. So I learned a little bit about some sides of the museum which you wouldn't otherwise know about. I didn't learn anything in the terms of ethnography. A little bit of archaeology, and that was it. And at the British Museum Ethnography Department, I had not much to do in the evenings, living in a hostel, and I just read my way through lots of these ethnographies, and got more and more interested. So, and I mean, self-education, we all educate ourselves, I suppose. I mean, I wasn't very impressed in retrospect with the course I was taught at anthropology course at UCL, and I think the most important insights I got into anthropology I got afterwards by reading books that weren't on our list in the first place. But it got me there, and so I went on, and here we are.
And did you have any training to be an education officer?
No, certainly not.
So how did you form that job for yourself?
Well, at the time, the BM was recruiting education research assistants to all the antiquities departments, and they just recruited graduates in whatever subject it was. And most of them, I think, probably more or less just went native in the department and became academic curators eventually, some of them quite senior ones. But the Museum of Mankind, well, it needed somebody to do the education work, somebody to inform the schools, to arrange things for the schools, to provide materials for teachers to help them interpret the exhibitions, to run film shows. I mean, I suppose, I can't really quite remember, but I must have made a lot of it up as I went along at first. And I got advice from various people, and as time went on, I got to meet various teachers and teachers' organisations and projects who had ideas of what the museum could do for schools, and so I worked with some of those as well. And no, I never had any training in teaching or in education at all, really. I sort of learnt on the job. And it was a mixed job as well, you know. I mean, at first I was also answering public inquiries with the other research assistants, and I didn't have any training for that either when it came to it, I suppose. But we all learn as we go along.
But you seem to have learnt a remarkable amount quite quickly, because the demands at the Museum of Mankind were actually quite strenuous, weren't they? There was regular demands, and you actually made an education relating, say, particularly to the Festival of Africa, the African Festival, which became a central feature of your education program.
That was towards the end, and it wasn't just down to me. By that time, I had a colleague, Penny Bateman, who was promoted as my manager, having been one of the research assistants. I don't know if we worked that hard. I mean, we were busy, we had plenty to do, It wasn't particularly stressful. I mean, it got more difficult when I decided I wanted to do some research on my own, on my own account, and to try to be an anthropologist, which I didn't consider that studying at university was sufficient. And then when I fixed up research arrangements, and I got a grant from the RAI actually, which is very nice, to do a few months in Solomon Islands, and all the writing up from that and the subsequent research, which became the basis of my PhD, I had to do that just about all in my own time. Well, I managed to slip a few things into working days as well, you know, but again, that was pretty much self-education in a way. I had supervision from UCL, but it was very slight, and I think I learned more from correspondence with other specialists in Solomon Islands, Roger Keating in particular, and other people like this. And so, yeah, so I ended up, well, doing education. Well, the thing about the education job, it meant I had to learn about the culture and society of all parts of the world that we dealt with, according to what exhibitions were on. So I was reading about Africa, like Ghana and the Asante of Ghana, the Yoruba of Nigeria, India, all these, Madagascar, the Canadian Arctic, all sorts of parts of the world, which I find very interesting. So I read the academic books and tried to turn them into short notes for teachers to try and convey what the exhibitions were about, according to what I thought they should be about sometimes, because the exhibitions weren't always as I would have done them. They tended to be rather ahistorical and ethnographic present and all this, that and the other, and not much context of recent history, colonial history of the people concerned. So I became really quite a generalist by learning a little bit about everything. So jack of all trades, I suppose. And I think that's perhaps why I wanted to really specialise and get my teeth into my own research, which I did when I went to Solomon Islands. But the education side of it, I don't know when I started thinking this, but it seemed to be that the exhibitions and most of the anthropological texts, including the catalogues and things like this, were really much too academic for the average reader, because my friends in the conservation section, who I was still friends with after I went to university, and the sorts of people I was mixing with outside, friends from various different backgrounds. I mean, it's like, what is ethnography? They haven't got a clue. Most of them had not a great deal of interest either, and I kept meeting Londoners who'd never been to the British Museum, and I'm still meeting them as well. So I thought really the obligation was that what I should be doing was to try and interpret what the museum was doing through its exhibitions in layman's terms that anybody could understand. That meant simplifying the language down, trying to find common English terms for all sort of academic jargon, like, I don't know, patrilineal, matrilineal, agnatic, cognatic, all these terms which, and as I tried to deconstruct those anthropological concepts, I started to realise that the terms really were actually doing their thinking for me, and they weren't really explaining what the interesting things were about particular kinds of descent or whatever. So I got more and more in the way of trying to rewrite anthropological information, historical information in terms which could be understood by anybody, including teachers, but also anybody else who wasn't particularly educated and needed some guidance, because, all right, anybody who's literate can read Malinowski or whoever else you want to name, any long, thick books you can think of, but they won't understand most of it. In fact, they get put off, they get bored, they just get lost in the jargon. So I tried to correct that, and when I went to do my own research, I tried to write in those terms as well. So that's what I've been doing all this time, really, yeah. Trying to interpret what I think are the valuable insights of anthropology and colonial history for people in Britain who really needed to know more about it, because very Eurocentric and racist attitudes that are current at the time and still quite current nowadays. I really felt that the museum's job was to challenge those kind of assumptions. And I think, to their credit, the keepers, the senior curators did too, except I'm not sure that most of them really had an idea how to do it, not in terms of writing anyway. So that's what I was doing. I was sort of being an interpreter for the academic side of the museum.
And yet, you did it with a particular view of culture and of politics. Through your book, it comes out. There's a class analysis lurking away there quietly beneath the surface. You yourself, as it were, come from a a mixed background. Your mother's family were quite wealthy, or quite posh, I think you used the word.
Posh, yes. Posh.
And your father came from a manual background.
Well, yeah, my mother's family, my grandmother was a daughter of a baron, and my grandfather was one of the members of a big paper company in Bristol, one of the biggest companies in Bristol. My mother went to, I don't think she even went to school until she was secondary age. She had governesses and things like this. You know, she was brought up in this really posh way of life where the parents only saw the children for a couple of hours after dinner each evening. The rest of the time they looked after by nannies and governesses. And that was my mum, and she rejected and rebelled about that, joined the Communist Party and various other things. Ended up on a communal farm in Prating in Essex, and that's where she met my father, who was apprentice fitter and tailor in a glassworks. Fitter and turner, not tailor, fitter and turner. And also a Methodist and a conscientious objector. So after spending some time in Maidstone prison for his beliefs, he ended up on this farm as well. They met there and married. So I was growing up very aware of the class differences between my parents' families. And it just made me very class conscious, I suppose. People have criticised me for being too class conscious, or imagining that the British class system still survives, and after all, it's all changed now, hasn't it? And it has changed, but it hasn't really gone away. So looking at the museum, it seemed, yeah, I could see these classes reflected in the structure of the museum from, you know, these, well, I mean, one of the trustees was always a nomination of the Queen, whichever one he was, professors and other notables among the trustees, and the keepers were sort of educated middle class. As further went down, the less educated we were, more or less, I suppose. And when you got to the conservation and the technicians and the warders and the cleaners and all the rest of it, they were really working class, mostly London, quite a few ethnic minorities. And it seemed to me it was like a microcosm of British society as I understood it. And so, I mean, that's coloured what I've written in this book, really. I'm looking at relationships between the keepers and the below stairs people. It's interesting also, the Museum of Mankind, the class system is reflected in the geography of the building, because all the working class jobs on the conservation, which eventually became more middle class when they got training, which they didn't have at first, they were in the basement. And then you went up to the students' room, which was a public inquiries with research assistants like me. And I suppose we were sort of younger middle class. And you go further up, and you got on the first floor, you've got some of the keepers in offices and off the galleries. And then when you get right up to the top, there's more keepers than the keeper himself, right on the top floor. And the only exception, I mean, the library was spoilt this pattern a little bit, because the librarians, well, I suppose they were middle class people, but they were right up on almost on the top floor, or in the basement with the books. But otherwise, I thought it was quite an interesting pattern, really. I don't think even if it was thought out, perhaps it's sort of instinctive. Now, so I shouldn't use a word like that as an anthropologist. Perhaps it's something deeply embedded in British culture that the higher classes should be somewhere up at the top of the building, you know. Unless you go right up to the top, of course, which is where I am now in the British Museum. Since we moved back, I'm in the East Residence, the two big wings of the museum which stick out from the front of the residences, because that's where the staff used to live. And the bigger rooms, like Listen here has a big office on the first floor, and some of the others there, and further you go up, and I'm up in the top in what was actually the servants' quarters. It must have been the servants' quarters, and little tiny offices, which were once bedrooms with fireplaces in them. And funny enough, the conservation section where I worked originally was in the basement of that same wing. So over the years, I started in the basement, and I've ended up in the servants' quarters at the top. It's also quite amusing, really. But yeah, that's the British Museum.
And I guess to some extent one could say that some of the patterns have persisted?
Well, I think the British class system is quite ingenious, and the BM is part of that. We're allowed enough liberties and a certain measure of democracy and freedom of action, as long as we don't make too much fuss. If you start making too much fuss, they jump on you.
Can we look at one of those cases where you got jumped on? And it relates to the your little teacher's book on Africa. Would you like to take us through that?
Oh, that was right at the end. I mean, that, I don't know whether this has been jumped on or not, but I would call it poor management, really. But I was trying to deconstruct the idea of Africa for the teachers to go with the Africa 95 festival, which was based around a sort of London-wide or countrywide art festival of African arts. And the Museum of Mankind, all its galleries were turned over to African themes for that year and more. And I was questioning, I've always been questioning what art is supposed to be, and I really don't think that anthropology has dealt with the problem. It's rather like, well, if you read Jane Austen or any other early books, society was a certain level of society, the upper class level of society. Anthropologists and others have taken that concept, turned it around and made it into relationships throughout the whole of society. Likewise, culture is still used as arts and stuff like that. And whereas anthropologists use it as the content of social knowledge, I suppose, or whatever. We all understand it differently to that. And I've always thought art was just about the same, really. So I was questioning what is, because I mean, having read since then, I read and taught a course at Birkbeck on this sort of subject, and I read some. None of this is my own ideas in the first place, but the way the concept of art developed in Western culture as the objects esteemed by a certain class of well-off people and collected through a commercial market. And so we have this idea of arts and crafts and all the rest of it, and what is art and what isn't art, and nobody can still make their minds up. I thought it might be useful to try and get to an idea of what art was in more general anthropological terms, and which I conclude really that it's like the creation and apprehension of pattern and the way it gives meaning to human creations, visually and intellectually. Anyway, that's another subject really. But anyway, with that sort of view of art, and then the question of Africa, what's Africa? Well, you know, Africa's full of all sorts of people from all over the place, and there's Africans all over the rest of the world as well. So I wrote this book called What is African Art? And I tried to include within it, well, different sorts of artifacts which might be artistic or whatever, and also the try to include immigrants to Africa, like, I mean, not immigrants, but long-standing non-black North African or whatever peoples, like north of the Sahara, Egypt, of course, the Arab peoples, Berbers and the rest of it. You go down the east coast and you've got all the Indians, people from the subcontinent of India and Arabia as well. Then you get down to the south and you've got these long-standing settlers from Holland and Britain. So, and then if you look elsewhere, you'll see that there's African people in North and South America and the Caribbean and anywhere else you want to look. So my idea was to try and get a more inclusive idea of what Africa was. I even included, this was a sort of, most of these booklets and things we did were done on the Photolithos setup at the British Museum. I just had to, this is pre-computers mostly. I had to get it all typed up, stuck together with paste and scans of photos, and then take it over to the litho section, and they'd make negatives of it and print it and so on. Anyway, so I had pretty free hand as what to put in it. I actually put in a couple of pages of African collections for the staff of the British Museum, but they included everybody from a white South African curator in prints and drawings, was she? And African Nigerian cleaner, Afro-Caribbean Guyanese clerk in the education office, all sorts of people like this. Tried to make that point. I don't know how well it worked or not, but anyway, it seemed to convince some people. And then the British Museum, under the Education Office, which was overseeing me by then, my colleagues suggested doing one, a nice glossy one for the museum. So I did a similar sort of thing, and it was based upon everything in the British Museum, all these African connections within the British Museum. Egypt, obviously, which, of course, as you'll know from usual definitions of ethnography, especially in museums, doesn't feature in ethnography. Roman and Greek, ancient Mediterranean civilizations, the Islamic conquest, so on and so forth, colonialism, and all the rest of it. And I could illustrate nearly all of those themes through objects in various parts of the British Museum, not just the Africa Gallery, but every other department as well. And this was pointed out to me by colleagues who were archaeologists as teachers in the British Museum Education Office. So I had them to thank for this, and I got that published. And I was quite pleased with it, really. And the director messed around with the cover and the title. But then I decided I wanted to get a few extra copies, so I went to the bookshop, and they didn't have it. They didn't know where it was. British Museum publication, they didn't have it in the bookshop. So I asked the publications company, and it all went all the way up, and it turns out that the director, Neil McGregor, had a meeting with the head of the publications company and decided that it shouldn't be sold. And I wasn't even told that, actually. I found that out in that way. I later got, jumped on. Well, I have been jumped on quite a few times because I'm always a bit bolshy. Sometimes, I don't always blame them for doing that. But I did get a telling off from the deputy keeper of ethnography, for causing trouble of some sort. I'd actually sent a contentious bit to the director's office to get it checked, because it mentioned questions of colonial looting, like Benin bronzes and things like this. And I managed to persuade the chap who was delegated to that it was okay, and so it was approved. And then it was banned, which I was really, really annoyed about, as you might understand. But there wasn't anything I could do, and that just, so you could say, whether it's jumping on or not, but the habit of making arbitrary decisions without consulting the people concerned is something which is, I suppose, goes back in the British class system all the way back to the British Museum and everywhere else, really. So, that's the sort of thing that I was always objecting to, right. Not being able to be heard by people in senior positions.
There may also be, of course, something about the culture shift. The Museum of Mankind does seem to have had a different culture to the rest of the museum. And it may relate to something you've already spoken about, which is the contrast between a context-focused display and an aesthetic display. And we could say, or can we say, that the Museum of Mankind actually cast off from the old system of an aesthetic display towards a context-specific one?
It didn't exactly cast off, and I'm not quite sure in the 1960s and earlier whether that distinction was very prominent in museums anyway. You'd be able to tell me, talk about that better than I could. When we moved to the Museum of Mankind, the keeper was William Fagg, who was an art historian, basically, of African art. And his exhibitions included this one they called Paddy Weave, somebody, I can't remember who, called Paddington Station, where there's all these like statues, wooden statues standing on plinths throughout the room like a crowded station platform. And they were chosen on aesthetic criteria as explicitly as art objects. But FAG also put on the first contextual exhibition was one of Benin, where you had a reconstruction of a courtyard in Benin with all the brass plaques on the pillars and the brass castings on the ancestral altars, which was very good. So, you know, the two, what you might call sort of art and ethnography aspects of the museum's work did sort of go together. But for me, and I think for most of the people I've spoken to over the years and since who visited the museum, what they really remembered was the contextual exhibitions where you had reconstructions of buildings and things like this with the artifacts displayed in some sort of resemblance to how they would have appeared originally when they were at home. And Yoruba and their gods, John Picton, all the sort of mud-built compound with all these votive objects for different gods in alcoves around the wall. People complained you couldn't really see them properly. The people who borrowed about, but that was the people who were really concerned about getting a good look at the artistic qualities, I think. And then there was Nomaden City, which was Arabia, part of the World of Islam Festival. Bedouin tent, Market Street in Sana'a in Yemen, and then a men's sitting room and a kitchen and all this stuff, all done by set builders, film set builders, and it was very convincing. We went on, we had Vashna, an Indian village, and various others that went on like this. But at the same time, there were these rather more arty exhibitions, or some of them were like ethnographic in their choice, in their classification. It's like it would be the culture of a particular part of the world and particular collections. Some of them became more and more focused on the artistic qualities, and of course the collections, when you think about it, a lot of the collections, if they're from, for instance, the Pacific, some Pacific exhibitions were done ethnographically, not really historically, but they displayed and displayed objects according to their use and their role in the society, this, that, and the other. But of course, a lot of those things were collected for their artistic merits in the first place, even before people thought of them as art, I suppose. So there was that side of it. And then there were some explicitly artistic exhibitions, and there was this, what was it, Treasures from the Collections, which is in the committee room, because the Museum of Mankind was originally built for London University, and it's got a very posh committee room on the first floor with all these painted and gilded mouldings and veneered cabinets and things like this. Not very good for putting any sort of exhibition in. So Treasures from the Collections was a nice easy way of putting lovely objects in display under spotlights without much intellectual effort. And then later on, when it was a program of changing exhibitions, in case I haven't mentioned it, we haven't realised that. So nothing stayed on, well, it shouldn't stay on for more than a few years. Some things stayed on for up to 10 years. But the idea was that the exhibitions would change so that different parts of the collection could be displayed in detail rather than just a sort of general coverage of everything, as in the old British Museum. And I had this introduction to the collections, which was actually just like Treasures, only it was a bigger gallery, and it was just bits and pieces from all over the place, like the old galleries, really.
But at the same time, Ben, there were some quite determined cultural political exhibitions, like the Living Arctic.
Yes.
Which really did have a point. For those that you didn't see it, the Indigenous Survival International was a group of peoples and their anthropologists around the Arctic area, and they were concerned with the decline in trapping, particularly for fur. And there was a big discussion about how appropriate it was for these people to carry on living their lives the way they did. And Hugh Brody's book and the wonderful exhibition, The Time, actually tackle that head on.
Yes, I mean, that was one of the exhibitions which actually did deal with contemporary issues, as so many others didn't. I mean, before that, there was an exhibition on hidden peoples of the Amazon, and sort of looking at titles like you were questioning me earlier. I mean, hidden, why are they hidden? Well, they've been hiding away because they've been persecuted, but that wasn't mentioned. And Survival International, which is actually the real survival, well, I say real, the British Survival International, not Indigenous Survival International in Canada. They tried to get mention of the contemporary situation and historical circumstances included in the exhibition, but the museum wouldn't do it. So there was a big fuss. Talk about being jumped on. Yeah, I tried to set up a lecture series organised with the Survival International to try and deal with these sorts of issues, and somebody higher up in the museum didn't like the sound of it because it appeared to be addressing head on what Survival International was saying. So they that was another time I got jumped on, and the whole thing the whole series got pulled. And but Living Arctic was a real contrast to that, because it was guided by these Indigenous organisations and funded by them and other Canadian groups. And the point, it was trying to make the point that basically, I suppose, we're still here and we're still trapping animals and we depend upon them for a living, and we've been doing it for generations. And it's a sustainable way to live in this environment. And so just about all of the displays in it, reconstructions, there was a canvas teepee, there was a log cabin, there was a snow house, which was the only archaic sort of building, and then there was a sort of prefab modern Inuit house with all mod cons. And so I thought that was very, very good, and I think native organisations approved of it and everything as well. And we had an education program that went with it, where we had an Inuit teacher coming on lead classes. So it's a strange mixture. But then, as time went on, the sort of artistic tendency seemed to predominate. And I'm not sure, I don't know enough about museum studies or whatever, which is one reason I made this book, didn't make this book academic, because I just couldn't speak about that much. Or it may have just been the personalities of some of the staff, and particularly the Africanists, where the exhibitions became more arty and less contextual, and started to include gallery art from Africa, the kind of thing which is displayed in galleries in Africa and in Britain. And whatever its merits, the problem I found was that it was really just the elite art, and the ordinary everyday stuff wasn't represented at all. For instance, I mean, I don't know how many, it's still the same now, I suppose. If you look at artistic production, if you take a sort of arty definition only, just think about sculptures coming out of Africa. It's all, well, I don't know what proportions, probably over 90% of the stuff that reaches Europe or anywhere else is made for sale by people who just want to earn some money from people like us who want some exotic artifacts or arty things to take home or to put on their mantelpiece or whatever. That stuff wasn't in there at all. And I thought this distinction was really invidious. I mean, it's the Sainsbury Gallery at present is like that. That was one of the galleries where we moved back to the British Museum, and it was curated by these same Africanists.
Could I just take you, because I think we're getting towards the end of our time. There is a sense, I think, in which you could say Museum of Mankind died at just the right time, but its time had come and its time had gone. That's to say that contextual exhibitions ceased to be a prominent feature, and that designing, gallery design, had become a major involvement. And you mention in your book 2 of the new galleries when you went back to the British Museum, the Mexican Gallery and the North American Gallery. And you regard them as being, as it were, almost the revenge of the designers.
Partly that. Also, I would say they were a reversion to old colonial style approaches to those subjects. I mean, what made me realise this was reading a book by Shelley Errington called The Death of Authentic Primitive Art. I think that's the correct title.
Yeah.
And she drew attention to the exhibitions, a Mexican exhibition in Mexican National Museum and to Native American museums in North America. And both of them were really like using the subject matter to reaffirm the control of the colonial majorities of those countries and the marginalisation of the native peoples. And the way our 2 exhibitions did it was just exactly like that. I mean, not from the same background, but I mean from the same basic attitudes. I mean, they were, we had to go back in behind glass cases when we moved to the BM, probably for reasons of cost, but also I think of policy. So the designers had a big impact on that and on other exhibitions too, like the Africa Gallery. I mean, it's led by designers rather than curators, I suppose. Well, that's probably not quite fair, but the curators and designers seem to align themselves quite well as regarding the content of the exhibition as being about art rather than about context or history and so on. So when you say that it was time for the museum to move back, well, I don't think the museum had finished serving its purpose of trying to illuminate non-Western cultures, trying to humanise the people they represented and trying to get beyond this rather exploitative colonial attitude to art as a sort of, I don't know, a bourgeois concept which is so dominant in Britain. That tendency sort of more or less won in the end, I think. Not completely, but so yes, contextual exhibitions are going out of fashion. And Nick, you probably know more about the general trend than most of us here, and I don't. But and they were regarded as passé by the Africanists in particular. So there was a shift in attitude from ethnography to art. And there was also the interests of moving back to the BM, where we had to have permanent galleries. We couldn't have shifting, changing exhibitions, which are obviously much more expensive in time and money to mount. And it was a bit like, okay, you've had your fun, back behind glass.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ben, and for putting up with my obtuse questions. I'd just like to finish by making a personal comment. When I was a junior lecturer, I actually had the opportunity to employ some 20 unemployed graduates in the 1980s, Thatcher's years. And we created something we rather portentously called ethnographic resources for art education. What it meant was these young people actually had the chance to go into museums and plunder them intellectually and visually to create teaching materials to go out to schools. And so with these 4 different projects, we went out and we probably made materials for about 3,000 schools over this 5-year period. And one of the only results was a little book like this, created by one of my colleagues out of the work done by the researchers. The reason I raise it is because the point of contact for all of this was the Museum of Mankind. And the person who's the contact was Ben Burt. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you for starting us off with such a beautiful and enthralling discourse. So absolutely wonderful. Whilst people are thinking of their questions, could you very briefly sum up, Ben, the genesis and the closure of the museum? I mean, it's actually rather unusual. You had a major space given over for just a couple of decades. Why did it open up and why did it close?
Well, the BM was getting overcrowded, and our department was one of the biggest and most cramped. And it was also, I would suggest, probably the least esteemed by the senior management. There were plans for the British Library to move out, as it did eventually, but it took a very, very long time. And that freed up, that was the idea, that would free up enough space for ethnography to move back in, and for all sorts of other things, as you see, the Great Court and the rest of it. And it did to some extent. Now, to tell you the truth, we still haven't got galleries for, well, we've only got galleries for, I don't know what proportion of our collection, but for certain sections only. There hasn't been an Oceanic gallery, well, basically we still haven't got the gallery space we deserve or what we had at the Museum of Mankind. But, so we were scheduled to move back in, and the building itself had been built for London University. I don't know what other things it went through, but it ended up, I think, being an office for the Civil Service Commission. Anyway, it was a government-owned building, so they let us have it or lease it or whatever for the period. And it was always assumed that we would go back to the British Museum eventually, as we did. And we moved back bit by bit as space became available when the new building works were finished and the British Library moved out. So it was done in stages. And the idea was that we should always have a presence in both places. The ethnography department shouldn't just disappear while we packed up and moved back. And that's what happened. The offices didn't move back until 2004, I think, whereas the galleries at the Museum of Mankind closed in 97.
So I understand that you moved back, but why did somebody say, let's shift them out in the first place? I'm thinking, the politics of representation and so on. Why exclude ethnography suddenly from the museum? Why not coins? Why not statues?
Well, good question. Yeah, why not? I don't know. Princeton. Well, where else could those places have gone? I don't know. I mean, if I was to choose what to move out, it wouldn't be ethnography. I'm pleased. I mean, I think we lost a lot by moving out of the Museum of Mankind, where we achieved some quite good things. But really speaking, ethnography should be with all the rest of the cultures of the world. It shouldn't be what was once defined as the savages and barbarians of history, which is what it was described in the Museum Ethnography Museum Department's handbook. And I can only assume that it was because it wasn't valued a great deal. And if you look at the history of the British Museum, what ended up as ethnography was shifted between all different departments over a couple of 100 years, as if the museum didn't really know what to do with it. Ended up as Oriental antiquities and ethnography, or Oriental ceramics and ethnography, I don't know, all these sorts of things. It was only in 1940 something, I think, that it became a separate department. So I think it's always been a Cinderella department. And I'm sorry to say that despite the best efforts of the staff at present and the great achievements they've made in raising project money and doing all sorts of new kinds of ventures and collaborations with source communities and all the rest of it, I still think it's marginalised compared to, well, I don't know, this is something which I shouldn't probably say as an employee of the museum, who we're not supposed to offer opinions on these sorts of things, but whatever was to happen to the Elgin marbles, I think the space it occupies could be better used by some of the ethnography collections.
I mean, yeah, I have heard it said by senior people in the museum that ethnography is anyway, the whole museum is ethnography, and therefore we don't need a separate department. I presume that's a bit of a...
Well, I mean, that's a very good point, and McGregor made the point of it being what was it, a museum for the world, of the world, for the world, all this sort of stuff, global museum idea, which is all very well. But if Africa is got just one gallery in about this, I don't know, it might be about the size of the Elgin Marbles Gallery for the whole of Africa in a basement, and native North America is and Mexico. Well, they're basically piddling little galleries, really, and very selective in what they display. And we're still, I know that the department is still, now Afro-Oceania in Americas is still trying to get exhibition space for the oceanic collections, and probably for all sorts of other stuff as well, you know. So I'm afraid the old classical and orientalist tendencies of the British Museum are still quite dominant.
Questions, please. Who would like to ask? Please go ahead.
It's not really a question, it's an observation. In Cape Town, there is a museum called the South African National Museum, and it has everything from enormous crystals to Bushman dioramas. And in the 1980s, the archaeology department at the University of Cape Town and an internal archaeologist at the South African Museum decided that these dioramas, which had been made from prisoners in the early 1900s, they were actual body casts, should be contextualized, because there was something else in Cape Town called the Cultural History Museum. And that was for the people from Holland and the people from Britain and the people from Malaysia who had culture.
Yeah.
Whereas the Bushmen and the Africans who were also represented in these kind of dioramas were parked with natural history.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's...
Well, that's familiar. I mean, it was like that. I mean, it's not for nothing that the American Museum of Natural History is one of the major anthropology or Native American museums. Native peoples were, well, they weren't regarded as civilized or really to be dealt with in the same way as classical and then, in order of priority, Oriental civilizations. I'm afraid that sort of, well, I'm not saying that people feel like that nowadays, but it's legacy of that period, this 19th century thing. Yeah, it's a colonial legacy, yeah. I'm sure. And the dioramas, well, I mean, there's also questions about dioramas as exhibiting people. I mean, I don't object to dioramas myself, and we had a model people in some of our contextual exhibitions. And we had real people in some of our exhibitions coming over as craft workers to demonstrate for the public in the galleries. I mean, I think mostly Native American, North and South. And that's
Toraja.
Oh, and Toraja, yeah, built a granary from Indonesia, and I mean that's been criticised as well because I mean it goes right the way back to the mid-19th century where you had these like world exhibitions with indigenous peoples in reconstructed villages, and they were criticised as being like human zoos.
Yes.
So I think we could do it differently like that. I mean, our guest artists or whatever were given full respect and everything, and came willingly and so on. So I don't see a problem with that at all, really. The dioramas, well, apart from maintaining the segregation between, you know, primitive peoples being natural history and the rest of culture being somewhere else, if that was to be corrected, I think it should be done through some sort of explanation of the history of how these dioramas are made. Because the dioramas themselves might be quite good.
That's what happened.
Yeah. Oh.
Was that they were described by an archaeologist who was at the Museum of Natural History, who then wrote about how they'd come about and who were the people involved and so on.
Yeah, I think the history of the history of museums is something which could actually be the focus of a little bit more attention in the BM and elsewhere. We have the Enlightenment Gallery, which highlights the beginning of, well, the Enlightenment period development of collecting of antiquities and natural history and so on. Doesn't really convey the colonial history of the British Museum. Not to say that the British Museum isn't waking up to that. I mean, I always think the British Museum is a little bit behind the times. You know, it managed to avoid charging entry fees when the Thatcher government tried to impose them. I think it was just didn't quite catch up with Thatcher and co. And I don't think it's quite caught up with colonial history, but it's trying. It is trying.
Well, it's having it forced on it, isn't it?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, all these things happen and don't just happen out of the goodwill, like abolishing slavery. They don't just happen out of the goodwill of the dominant party. But it is happening now, and I'm very pleased to say, and I think I mentioned it in one or two conferences or something like this, that the sorts of issues these people are raising in their conferences about decolonising museums are very much like what I was trying to do 20 or 30 years previously. And didn't make much impact then, well, apart from in the Museum of Mankind itself to some extent. So I felt I was quite gratified to see that the rest of the museums are catching up with me a bit, you know. Sorry, that's rather arrogant. But they're not doing it in the same way, of course, really. But I mean, I could see these kinds of issues back then and tried to do something about them. So it isn't just a brand new movement that's decolonising. And I'm not the only one who was doing it either, so there we are.
The question you started with about the name of the Museum of Mankind, that was Kenneth Clark, who was a trustee of the British Museum at the time, and he'd just had this television series on civilization. And he said, we have to use this term, which is wonderful, Musée Long. So it's just a translation of Musée Long, that's how it came about. What I would like to ask you, Ben, is if you feel free to say a little bit more about what happened when the Museum of Mankind moved back to the British Museum in 94, was it?
2004. Well, when
it started in 94.
Staff will move back. Well, not all the staff, because the stores were always in a separate building in the East End, and a lot of them haven't moved out of that yet.
Yes. Eventually it came back officially. Yeah. And it was about a week later that Neil McGregor walked into a staff meeting and said, we're abolishing ethnography.
Yes. I'm sorry to say I can't speak about that myself, because I was in Solomon Islands at the time on research.
Well, I'll ask a slightly different version.
But I heard all about it and everybody was very unhappy.
Yes, it must be discussed at the time.
Yeah.
Although I found it absolutely horrifying at the time, and I was trying to get some of the curators in what had been the ethnography department to say something about it. And I think they all said, no, better just keep quiet about it. And it's going to be fine, because they'd invented this new department, which is the Department of Africa, Oceania, and Americas. The question, what do those three parts of the world have in common?
Well, what they have in common with large parts of Asia as well is that they were colonised, and their inhabitants and cultures are regarded as second rate, and hence as ethnography. I think that's a bit of a crude way of putting it, but
so it's reconstructed the Museum of Mankind as a colonial museum or ex-colonial museum collection.
I suppose so. There's somebody else here who could contribute more on that subject, who's now running the department. But I don't think she's had any more choice in the matter than anybody else.
No.
Yeah, I mean,
but the rest of the museum is largely classical archaeology.
No, not necessarily. I mean, the Oriental department has. It depends how civilized you were as to whether you ended up in ethnography or in Oriental.
But the ethnography part of the Asian sections hardly exists in the museum.
It's been moved into the Oriental Antiquities Department, which
Yeah.
is now the Asia Department. So they do actually own it.
Yeah.
They don't show it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's another part of the problem. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think it's a good thing that the Asian collections went in with the Oriental collections. I mean, I remember when we had this Vashno Indian Village exhibition, and there was an exhibition of Indian art or architecture or sort of fine art stuff over at the BM at the same time, as part of the same festival of India. And of course, you know, we were exhibiting the lifestyle of the ordinary peasants and craft workers who supported these great civilizations and their great architectural artistic achievements, and the two were separated out because the peasants were not regarded as relevant to the civilizations, and that's the sort of attitude that was taken, well, right throughout Asia, I suppose. And so in ethnography, the Asian collections we had were mostly either peasant or ethnic minority groups. I suppose the exceptions could be Indonesia, where there were quite well developed, very well developed kingdoms, where all the regalia and artistic achievements of the ruling groups were included in ethnography rather than in Oriental. But so it seemed to be very sensible and necessary. It should have been done, well, it should never have been separated in the first place. But as to what happened after that, well, they all went into a department of art historians, all this stuff. But I think they employed one anthropologist for a while, but from what I heard, she found it too difficult to work in this art historical context, and so she left and did something else.
Yeah.
And
Can I just ask you one more thing about this? I don't want to sort of go on too much, but I think that the Museum of Mankind was wonderful. And I think particularly when Malcolm MacLeod was the keeper and insisting on real ethnographic contextualization of materials. And you give that very useful appendix about the exhibitions in the last year or two in the Museum of Mankind, and just going through them, they're fascinating series of highly contextualized, modern, not sort of classical, sometime in the vaguely distant past, really contextualized, up-to-date exhibitions. And as you say, not under glass, and changing. And that seems to me to be absolutely ideal. And its disappearance into this, I know these sons and others are doing their very best with what they've been given there, but it seems to me that something very, very, very valuable has been lost, and that it's going to be very difficult to recreate a realistic ethnography in the highly constrained situation in which you find yourselves in the museum.
yeah, I think it's true, but it might be inevitable. There was a shift in the artistic direction. I mean, even Malcolm MacLeod, even though he presided over so many of these contextual exhibitions, he was shifting his interest or his perspective towards art history or gallery art or whatever you like to call it, you know, Western concepts of art. And I think really it was probably a change in museum fashions generally. And I think it is a shame that we've lost the contextual exhibitions. And the challenge really is to put on glass case exhibitions which actually provide the context in other ways. If you can't do it through reconstructions, I mean, photographs are a very good way of doing it. Unfortunately, this is where what Nick asked about the design, dominance of the design. The designers were really wanted things. They were really sort of art history or art object exhibition designers. They didn't really understand what we were trying to do as anthropologists in some of those galleries, and so very constrained by the size of photographic images and also the placing of text and all the other sorts of things which make those galleries rather more like the rest of the BM than they could have been, I think.
Well, Richard was first, but then this one, we'll have to
Can I just make a
translate
quick
this.
comment
Okay.
on the glass, just because I'm very sympathetic with a lot of what's being said. So, but I think you do have to admit that because just before COVID, we were getting nearly 7 million visitors a year, and the visitors are very hard on an exhibition. So a lot of the objects are in cases for their own for their own protection, and not because, I mean, I don't want to be defending this whole approach, because I don't like the glass case object not fence style and anyone else does, but I do think, to be fair, you have to admit that that's the trail of sticky fingers across the bottom of objects is, you know, a conservation nightmare. And when there are 20,000 visitors a day, as there now are again, that's a lot of sticky fingers. So
Yeah,
I just thought I should make that simple comment.
none of these things are that simple. There's also the expense and the space and all the rest of it, which are constraints on this policy as well, I think.
I'm sure we can come back to all these things. You'd like to say something, Richard?
Yeah, okay. I enjoyed reading the book, so thanks for writing it. I wanted to ask you, which I don't think you talk about an awful lot in the book, about the difference between being an education officer at the BM and being an education officer at the Museum of Mankind, and the extent to which this comes down to the type of footfall you're getting, which kind of the samples talk about, but not just in terms of the quantity, but in terms of the sort of the qualitative makeup of your footfall. Because what I remember when we were both students, you know, at UCL back in the 70s, was that the Museum of Mankind was sort of secondary community hub. You go down there and you bump into all the people who were studying at the different, you know, anthropology departments in London. The footfall was probably relatively small, but you were getting the same people over and over again, and probably the same schools coming over and over again, so that when you sat down to write those educational materials, you had a bunch of people who'd already selected to come to the Museum of Mankind rather than go somewhere else, were probably interested in the exhibition, particular exhibition you had on, and had a certain knowledge of at least what they wanted to be educated about, what they wanted to be informed about. And so they sort of volunteered for your educational experience one way or another, and a lot of them were repeat visitors and part of your community. Whereas with the British Museum, you've got this huge influx of people, you know, a high proportion of whom will be tourists rather than locals, and therefore not regular visitors, who may not particularly have come to see anything to do with what used to be the ethnography department. They may be there to see the Elgin marbles and stumble into the welcome gallery and think, what on earth is this one about, and why is the middle of it full of pills? I don't have a stayed in history here recently or something like that. So this must be, seriously, it must be a real challenge to you, because you've come from a context where you kind of knew who'd signed up to get educated, and now you're an education officer, which you might be facing masses of people who have no wish to be educated by you whatsoever, and who won't be repeat visitors. Because if you've been once to the Africa Gallery, why would you conceivably want to go twice? Because it never changes, you know.
Yeah, well, that's one side of it, never change. Well, I did put the school attendance figures, some of them in the book. I can't remember what they are now, nor do I know enough to compare them to other museums of a similar size. Oh, yes, we had some teachers that would come back again and again, but lots of others that didn't, and lots of teachers never take people to museums anyway. So I can't really comment on the motives of the teachers, except that, well, for instance, with the Africa exhibitions, they wanted to teach about Africa for sort of reasons that they have, the multiculturalism and these other ideas that were going around at the time. They wanted the kids to learn about Africa, and that we were the place that could do that. And it might have been the same with some of the other sections as well. So, yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, I can't even tell you really how well received my booklets and things were for those exhibitions. Some of the activity programs we did go very well. I mean, we got very complimentary comments when we employed African teachers to do reenactment program for a full day, research in the galleries and craft work and all the rest of it. And Palestinian exhibition, likewise with a Palestinian teacher and participants, that went very well. And Mexico, which Chloe Sayer here has made a major contribution to, that included Mexican craft workers and teachers. Sorry, I'm not really in a position to evaluate how well we did compared to everybody else. Reason I took that particular tactics, the reason I made the education service what it was there, was because the main British Museum couldn't provide for it. It didn't have any staff who were acquainted with it, and it's half a mile away and had plenty of other things to do. So I took on the job of really, I mean, it was everything from arranging the school bookings to organising teachers and conducting teachers in set days and all the rest of it. The only thing I didn't really do was teach. But what was most successful, I think, was the education programmes, which were the work primarily of Penny Bateman, and she was the instigator and the driving force, and I supported her in doing that. So I don't know if that answers any questions or not.
No, I was thinking of the comparison then between, I can kind of see how the Museum of Mankind works as a focus for education, and for somebody like you to be entrepreneurial about the way education delivered. I struggle much more to understand how you do the same thing in the British Museum. Okay, I see you can do it for school parties, but if part of it, could you talk at some point about not just doing stuff for schools, but you're interested in captioning, 3 levels of captioning, so that general visitors will be able to understand the level of specificity of knowledge they actually want, and so on and so forth. And I can see how all that works for the Museum of Mankind, insofar as you're allowed to do it, and I know you've got What I don't understand so well is how you can transport that set of skills and that set of interests and so forth, and take it to the British Museum when you've got all these people flooding in, really wanting to see the Elgin marbles, or the ceramic collection or something or other.
I don't think it transferred to the British Museum, but it didn't die. It actually moved to the Horniman and to the Commonwealth Institute. And the Commonwealth Institute, of course, was where it met its fate, because it was the Commonwealth Institute which was singled out by the government as being not one of us. And that actually put a very strong block on the whole multicultural educational program around museums. So it didn't die with the British Museum, and it's still sort of there in a whole range of other museums. All these museums that are now called world museums still have some kind of sense of the contextualization that really came from the Museum of Mankind. And I think that's what the Museum of Mankind really stood for most seriously.
But I think your question is what happens now, isn't that what your question is?
How much more difficult is it to do it in that major environment?
It became very difficult, for several reasons. We didn't have educational facilities anything like as good as the Museum of Mankind. Even when it came to film shows, our films might be shown among many others from other departments. We didn't have an activity room, where you need a dedicated room, not just a seminar room that you can book for a couple of hours, somewhere you can set up sets and everything like that. We couldn't get that. We had a handling collection, which I assembled at the Museum of Mankind over the years, and we couldn't even keep that eventually. I mean, it was put into an old theatre. I mean, because that's something that is extremely useful. The kids and teachers or whatever, students can actually handle objects of the kind they see, and you can have classes around the objects. That was put into an old theatre. When that had to be used for something else, it was put into some old book stacks vacated by the British Library, and then eventually, I don't know what happened, I just got fed up with it. Actually, I haven't moved the bloody thing 2 or 3 times, and I was still using it. I mean, it's another thing we could have done. We did for a while. We had an arrangement with UCL that anthropology students, I think they were anthropology or they museology, I don't know, probably anthropology department, would come and do some curation work on that handling collection, which meant really just all the things which I didn't really have the time to do, like checking what was there and accessioning new things and putting them in order and all the rest of it, and under my direction. And I think some of those students found it quite useful, and so there's all sorts of things that could have been done. But the head of education changed was one thing. John Reeve was the head most of the time I was there, and he was very supportive of these things, though he had so many other things to deal with in the museum. But the next head of education really didn't want a handling collection, so I had to go. And likewise, the activity programs, Well, they depended a lot on sponsorship to get in specialist teachers and things like this, and the sponsorship mostly depended on the curators who were raising funds for their exhibitions. So there wasn't really any willpower on the part of the senior staff in the department to keep these sorts of things going, and so they just gradually faded. I mean, the education staff at the BM were very good. They would have probably come on board with a lot of this stuff, and I found very good colleagues, but they were just accustomed to do much more like classroom or gallery teaching, which they still do. So yeah, I think that's a shame too. Yeah, but anyway, we had its day. You can read about it instead.
The other thing is that the overall nature of the education focus changed completely, and it dropped the name Department of Education quite soon after we came back. Now it's something like learning and national partnerships, which really it's hard to see a connection with education in a name like that. But it's focused because it's not just in the Department of Africa, it's in America, but
Yeah.
I would like to ask, over today, if you ask around the world curators of what let's call them ethnographic museums, what's the point of them? How many different answers would you get, and how, to what extent have those answers changed in your lifetime?
Well, I think Nick would be a better person to answer that, but as far as I can see, there is still a need for ethnographic museums. So I don't see the need to call them ethnographic museums. I think they should be cultural museums, and you decide according to the size of it or the scope of it, whether it's divided into several museums by continents or whatever else, or they're all in one museum like the provincial museums here.
I think that's not quite what I'm. If you think of the totality of museums that are showing the content that I was certainly used to calling ethnographic museums, what's the point? I think if you ask that to a Victorian curator when these museums were largely first being put together in a recognizable way, would actually have a very strong and coherent answer. I suspect that's actually in some ways started breaking down with the Museum of Mankind, which I remember from its very early days. I thought it was wonderful and I thought it was liberating, and actually, in a sense, that was because the directors saw the point of museums changing.
Yeah,
well, you could argue that, but then in the subsequent half a century, I think that's now, my perception is, that's evolving, but it's going down all sorts of different routes.
I suppose that's inevitable. I mean, I think if the category of ethnography was either abolished or revised to include all human description of all human cultures, that would be a start. But I mean, that's probably asking quite a lot. But I mean, all right. So a Victorian curator, we were displaying they wouldn't have called it then maybe, but the spoils of empire, demonstrating our growing knowledge of all the dominions of the British Empire and all the other ones, and so on, and the curiosity about other non-Western ways of life, and explaining European history has ended up at the top of the pile of evolutionary development, and so on. I think what they should be doing now is actually trying to redress some of the ills caused by that kind of Eurocentric approach over the years, and try to humanize cultures we're not familiar with and show their history, not just their culture in some sort of static way, but try to acquaint us with other parts of the world and their inhabitants and their cultures, so that we will do something towards educating, well, especially the British population, but anybody else who comes, to take a different view of world history and culture. And there's all sorts of other sort of agendas which could or should be built into that, which include actually more detail on colonial history and also environmental issues and all the rest of it. So I still think that the societies we dealt with as ethnography do deserve and require curation and exhibition in museums nowadays, if museums are worth anything at all.
Can I just add to that? Yeah. I think there are two and possibly more traditions that can claim to be ethnographic. The one is the Euro-American one, which does seem to me to be about the division of cultures into primitive and advanced. And the German one, which is much more relaxed and doesn't have the same kind of prejudices built right into the very foundations of it. I think one of the things that we need to do in this society is to acknowledge that we do have this background, which has been exported to colonial countries around the world, and that the Museum of Mankind, in a sense, was helping to unpick, but which now doesn't have that kind of anchor anymore of humanism, which we need in order to talk about cultures having any kind of equivalence or any kind of political content. Because at the end of the day, there is a politics at the bottom of it all. And ethnographic theory cannot avoid the conjunction with political and racist developments. And I think that what Ben has been doing has been showing us how the Museum of Mankind has been involved in that kind of unpicking. And that's, I think, what's most valuable about it.
But I do think, I think that, yeah, and my first memory, I can remember it now, it's over 50 years ago, I think, walking in those doors and seeing that most wonderful Islamic sculpture on the staircase, and then being drawn to William Empson's poem, which I have just got up, and we're talking about a humanistic vision. This is why I thought the museum, you couldn't not be drawn to that poem. And he says, having given this wonderful description of the, as he calls it in this odd line of poem, there is a supreme God in the ethnographic section. And there it was. And he said, attending there, let us absorb the cultures of nations and dissolve into our judgment all their codes. And he goes on to say, then let us stand there here and admit we have no road, being everything. Let us admit that is to be something. Well, that is actually the most extraordinary vision. But it's not a vision, it's a vision of, in a sense, it's a passive vision. You're offering something for everyone to make sense in a way that they can. I thought that was the most wonderful and really liberating vision. And then you help people, contextualize and understand it. But there is another way that museums are being used, I think perhaps increasingly, and perhaps as they were in Victorian times. And as you said, there was an objective, it could be an evolutionary ladder or whatever. Today, quite often it seems to me, museum curators are actually seeing their role as having a particular message. They want their message heard, rather than, I think perhaps that's not a bad comparison.
Is there something like to come in?
Yeah, no, I think one of the interesting things and very important things that's happened, you were asking about the sort of change over time, and I think that museums, the idea of museum as stasis is just ridiculous, because museums change as much as anything. But one of the things that's happened in the last 30 years, but perhaps especially in the last 15 years, has been the re-engagement by source communities, the people whose objects are in the museum, with those objects, and the ways in which those objects have become incredibly important to them for re-establishing, in settler colonial context, certainly for re-establishing identity, and in other, and to sort of prosecute a number of different political and social concerns that they might have in their own places. And so what museum curators are doing more and more is engaging with communities, hearing what they're saying, and what they're saying does affect how we then present collections. I mean, Ben's been part of that process, the work he's done in Solomon, so this is not to sort of, so I think that this is a huge change, and it can be quite simplified and politicized, and it can also be quite sophisticated, and different groups come in at different levels with different objectives. But the engagement of those originating, I mean, the people for whom those objects are part of their cultural heritage, that engagement is the big change in museums, especially in the last 50 years. And even for us, and even if I think our galleries are stuck behind glass, but in terms of what happens in the storerooms, that's really what so many visitors now are communities to the storerooms.
A tiny little example of that. We were fortunate enough to talk to Brazilian colleagues after their terrible tragedy of the National Museum burning down. And what they were telling us is they were flooded with offers from the indigenous communities in Brazil, saying, "Don't worry, please don't cry. We will make you more artifacts, and we will refill your ethnographic collections as soon as you possibly can." And so that was for me a very, very clear example of how that dynamic is changing.
So I think that, well, the Epstein's reaction and many others to non-Western sculpture and so on, I tend to think that if it's as I say, let the art or let the objects speak for themselves. But my problem with that sort of approach is that they will speak for themselves, but they'll only tell you what you already know, or based on what you already know, where you're already coming from. This is why I think they do need the curatorial interpretation, and how to do it and what your agenda is something for a great deal of discussion and controversy a lot of the time as well. But so I don't think that artistic approach to exhibitions is sufficient. It doesn't mean to say that if that statue of Ku was displayed on a reconstruction of a Hawaiian marae or temple, that doesn't stop Epstein or anybody appreciating it in his own terms. But I think people should be given the opportunity to try and understand what the terms of the originators of the things. And that's something which is done through anthropological commentary. It's not easy to do, and maybe it could be mistaken, but I do think that should be our objective, really, to try and communicate something about the cultures those objects came from.
But the question about the internationalization or the international aspects, I think, is a very good one. I mean, you've got, of course, the new French Ethnographic Museum, combined with the closure of the museum in Darwin. Were you working closely with your European counterparts, and how do you see these changes?
I'm sorry, I had very little to do with that, because I mean, as that other review, the RAI review, suggested, it wasn't a very theoretical book, and that is because I'm not very good at museum theory, and I could have sort of spent a lot of time reading up all the museological studies that have been written since I was a student, but I didn't have the patience to do it.
I was thinking more practically. Were people visiting from Germany and France and sharing ideas, and you talking with them?
I'm not sure. If they weren't talking to me.
Oh,
They would have been talking. I mean, it's like the keepers. After a certain amount of time, when there was a new exhibition planned, I would be, and my colleague Penny would be invited to sit in on some of the planning meetings, and we make all sorts of recommendations of what we thought might make the exhibition more useful for education or anything else we wanted to comment on in that way. Not that a lot of notice was taken of what we said, but really all those curatorial discussions went on well over our heads, I think, most of the time, if they went on at all, and I'm not sure whether they did. You'd have to ask some of the people who were there at the time. Yeah. Like, for instance, Malcolm MacLeod would be able to be the best person to.
Yes, I'm sorry, Malcolm's not here today. We should have invited him. Any more questions? Because one thing I did want to raise was that for me, the other great change, this I've talked about the first time, is the relationship between university departments and museums. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, or when I began as a postgraduate at the museum in Cambridge, when you opened the door, the dust used to fall off onto the floor. I mean, it was that unused by the university and indeed by the general public. And anyway, so clearly something very, very important has changed. I don't know how you see that.
Well, there were moves to get us collaborating with University of London, especially University College, and they're reading sort of seminars for staff and academics at the college rather than the students. And then there were when I was helping, when these students are helping me curate the Handling collection, it wasn't my initiative, though, it was the education department and others, but they were always trying to make these links with the universities, and it would work for a while. I mean, it's the same as making links with, for instance, Survival International, who we had this big row with over the Amazon exhibition. I did later manage to get them to come along and organise with us some seminars or study days on particular subjects of interest to them, like East African hunters or whatever, things like this. So, I mean, collaboration with different groups. I suppose they probably didn't really go deep enough to last very long. I mean, there was a similar collaboration in the last years, mainly at the BM, with Birkbeck College on a World Art course, which I was teaching with a Birkbeck colleague. And I think that went very well. But then different things changed in educational funding and policy in the department, or not the department so much as the education office of the BM, so these things tend to come and go, and I don't think they've ever really taken deep root, as I can see.
Could I just add, one of the major changes has been, and it's being felt more and more, is curatorial programs in universities, which almost didn't exist 20 years ago, and now are major developments in postgraduate education. So the number of people coming through curatorial courses now are in their thousands, many more than we actually need in the museum sector.
Can I say, what about the expansion of the museum into the internet? Because if you can't do the contextualization by actually building tin-roofed Yoruba houses or whatever it is, or grain farms or whatever, I mean, is the alternative going to be greater use of visualization through the internet? Because when I go to the British Museum, I notice that many visitors are rather more interested in the reconstruction of what the Parthenon might have looked like than some of these rather difficult to envisage fragments of what's left of the marbles, and a lot of the archaeological exhibitions as well have got a fair amount of context. I don't know how much of it is online because I haven't really looked, but I know from my own work that I rely now very heavily on the increasing availability of object images online, in the way that 20 odd years ago you had to go there, and now you just sit and get backache looking at all these different objects and comparing them. So do you think something that you have done with pamphlets and so on, and with installation and so, will eventually instead be visualizable on the internet?
Well, I'm sure. I mean, the British Museum is developing its online provision, including photos and other materials and documents. And Alyson should really say something about this. But just before she does, I mean, one thing I have found that there's an ASAO session coming up on which focuses on repatriating ethnographic knowledge to source communities and things like this. And I found it very useful for doing that. I mean, I've been able to post documents, film notes, or whatever on the internet and return information like that. And the BM is supportive of that kind of thing. It doesn't have a great deal of resources to do it, but then I think Alyson should really comment on that, because you're much more concerned with it, I suppose, aren't you?
Well, I think I can mainly speak with authority about the department itself.
Yeah.
And so we have a number of programs where we, so the Santo Domingo Centre for Excellence in Latin American Research, long title, has a website where we put a lot of results of collaborative programs we're doing in Latin America. And the other big program we have is called the Endangered Material Knowledge Program, which is a grant-giving program by which we give grants to people all over the world, ideally with community representation in the group, to document knowledge about how objects are made, used, mended, the whole realm of social interaction around objects. And that information comes then into a digital repository and is available online. And that's something we're building at the moment. And that seems to me to be a really important way to make information more broadly available with the consent of the community. But in terms of there's so much that could be done, and it's always a matter of the specific management at the time, how much they emphasise that and how much they don't.
The other difficulty is really for any sustained viable project, we really need sponsorship and collaboration, because we don't have the resources to do much ourselves, and these two programs that Listen mentioned have really made a big difference in the last few years. But so other things like the Google Maya project was very useful. The Africa project, which was another really successful venture, but the money's gone for those two now. I think it's a case of waiting until we can get some more collaborations and more funding to do more.
It's more like a personal, in the sense that you, like you said, like speaking with colleagues, going out to the pub, and then like writing a book. So now that nowadays a concrete memory, do you dwell more in the kind of nostalgia, or like that is now gone, is in a book, and you can focus like on the thing that you're doing now, and there's enthusiasm for present and future?
Yeah, in terms of our department and in terms of my own, well, I haven't really done any original research for quite a while, but I'm still sort of processing stuff. I can be inspired by some of the things which are going on. In particular, I think the increasing connection with the source communities and the way that the museum's resources are being put at their disposal. And I think that's really what the future of museums should be. And having my own anthropological research in Solomon Islands, I've tried to return as much of it as I can through publications, including bilingual ones and pictorial ones and so on and so forth. And I still find those things worth doing, and they're easier now than they used to be. So no, I don't feel, well, I feel nostalgic socially in a way, but I don't really, no, I think there's plenty of things of interest in the museum, and including in our department, AOA, at present, to get involved in or to talk to the colleagues who are doing it, which I do occasionally. So I think there's a lot of interesting things going on, really. Yeah.
But I think the question is more: has writing this book given you a sense of closure, so that you can start with new things?
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. I mean, I've got enough to keep me busy, but I'm finding it hard to retire, to be honest.
Oh, don't do that. There is a question from Suzanne Hamacher in the chat here, one of our remote audience. She says, don't forget that the Museum of Mankind had a public programme with regular ethnographic film screenings, and an impressive archive film collection. I don't know what happened to that. I'd like to have that, by the way, Reg. You're already giving that away.
Well, I'd like you to have it, but it's really out of my hands, has been for quite a long time. We did try to give it to you, but then I can't remember what happened. Somewhere in the bureaucracy of the BM, it never came off, or maybe you couldn't afford to keep it, or I don't know what.
We'll talk about it. And then
yeah, we should.
But what Sam would like to ask, she says she remembers a brochure which described something like a visible storage building on a World Textile Research Centre in a disused post office building south of the BM.
Yeah.
Now, for those who are not old enough to remember that, and I must admit I'm still too young to remember that, I only heard about it, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that for the record.
Yeah, there was a plan to have what they was going to call a study centre, to relocate our stores and other stores from other departments. Our stores in this separate building in the East End. And to get lottery funding and to make it a worthwhile project and so on, it was agreed to make it a study centre rather than just a store. And we worked out all sorts of programmes of how we could give access to the collections and how we could run education programmes and so on and so forth. Everybody worked very hard on planning for that, including Helen, who sat there, who organised, you know, designed a textile centre for the grant funding from the Cloth Workers Guild. And then, I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but for some reason or other, the museum, the trustees just pulled the plug on it. Maybe it's got costing more than they could afford, and there was all the additional costs of refurbishing the BM at the same time. Or who knows, really. I mean, I would have thought they could have kept it as a store, which would have been much more convenient to the BM at present, because they bought the building, you know. So they bought the building and then they sold it again, and that was it. So a lot of wasted time and effort by a lot of people.
My memory is that the RAI was going to move in, if you might remember. And so we were going to basically be all working together.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities. It's a real shame. Yeah, it was just before McGregor started, and I do remember him sort of apologising to the staff for what he saw as a mistake or a failure on behalf of the museum to carry out that project when he first started. Yeah.
Well, as we conclude, I can say is that, look, it's not too late. So if we ever find a nice big empty building in London,
oh yeah, I mean that's the thing, isn't it? If you find a building, yeah.
Well, we've got just time for something. Anybody wants to make a final point? We've got time for one more final point. If anybody hasn't said anything yet, please do. Go ahead, sir.
Tim made this point a while ago, but
Go ahead.
how convenient was the club's still going. But as to go back on the education kind of the removal of removal is not quite the right word, but again, constantly about the engaging of the getting rid of things like the handling and things like that, and going to more kind of lectury talking. Maybe I completely misunderstood, but I think that getting or stopping that was a bit of a mistake, because I always get excited when there's handling opportunities in museums. I think that's partly because, like Lisa was saying earlier about the glass thing and how it's conservation is an issue. I think that's why handling is so excitable, because it's like I get to feel an object. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is, when the museum, and maybe I completely misunderstood what you said earlier, this was a while back, that the Museum of the Mankind stopped the kind of more engaging, or in my opinion, more engaging things like handling and I can't remember what else he said, but
enactments.
Yes.
that it's particularly if you're talking from a standpoint of like a child or person less engaged in or doesn't know a lot about anthropology or ethnography, handling things and kind of engaging is much more interesting than kind of a talk or
Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah.
waffling a little bit, because
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it really captures people's imagination. Yeah,
The handling collection is still there.
some of it.
It has been at Blythe House, and the education took part of it.
Did
So
they?
they've been using, there's still some.
There's still handling desks, but there's a limited amount.
Yes, the
Yeah.
education department used to take up schools and things, but the handling collection has been there, and it still is there.
When I knew it went there, that's when I gave up on
I
it,
know,
because I just got fed up with trying to look after it and move it around. And the same occurred with the film collection. I had to move the bloody film collection by hand, myself, in from one cupboard to store to another. And because there wasn't any attention being paid by the central authorities, principally by the head of the education office at that time, I think it was. That's why it went. They could have, they could have done so many of the things we did at Museum of Mankind if anybody was really interested in doing it. My position changed, and I was quite glad in the end to be able to move into more curatorial and academic work rather than doing the education.
I think when we first went back to the museum, we did do handling workshops. I know
Yes.
Chloe did textiles and
Oh,
things
good.
like that.
Good.
But again, you could only have a few people. And going back to what you were saying, going back to the Big British Museum, they didn't want us to do workshops that you could only have 20 people in. They wanted something to cater for people. So we stopped doing those more hands-on workshops.
Yeah.
We're at time. We could carry on. I should just apologise to Steve Hooper. I'm afraid, no, I didn't see your question, and it still isn't on the screen. Steve Hooper would like to ask a question about fag and a piece of cake. It's very intriguing, Steve, but honestly, your question isn't here.
Well, I know that he's
it's not that
talking
my
about.
Q&A is completely blank.
No,
I've got no questions to talk with my Q&A here.
I can deal with that.
But never mind.
There's an incident that I put in the book where it was like, I mean, this thing about the class system, one time everybody got together was Christmas parties. And even though the academics and the working class people were not very comfortable with each other, there was a lot of goodwill and a lot of fun. Yes. And Albert Davis, who was renowned for, he started in a heavy gang as a labourer and ended up in charge of the stores. And he was a very heavy smoker as well, which may account for something of this. But anyway, I mean, it's just an incident that I didn't witness. Somebody, and it was repeated lots of times. And he went up to Mr. Fag and said, "Have a fag, Mr. Cake." So that was...
I see. There we are then. Anyway, so sorry about the technical problem, and anyway, we thank our speakers for an absolutely enthralling evening. So thank you very much.